was at the farm, Mr. Bell jokingly asked us all, do we want bees on the farm? Everyone dismissed it like it wasn't a discussion to be had, but I was the one to say, why not have bees? Our first, when he was going over the terms, he told me that if I didn't take care of the bees because I got stung and I didn't like them anymore, I would still have to take care of them and I would have to, feed them. I agreed to his terms, and our first encounter with the bees, we didn't have any of the proper equipment to effectively go into the hives. So I actually got stung on my elbow, and at that point, I don't want these things. But as time progressed, I started to come attached to the bees in some sense. Because once you get to see them start something from nothing, you get to see the intricate things that they can actually do in the hive by themselves without any maintenance from humans. It's pretty amazing.
That's great. I think that's an important tip for our audience who might want to take care of bees, that if you want to take care of bees, the suit is an important piece of equipment. We've got a picture of your hive up there on the screen. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first thing I'm going to start off with a question. Can you find the queen bee? And the reason for this question is because it is one of the first things that we check for in the Healthy Colony checklist.
That's great. Kamal, can you tell us a little bit more about this colony checklist?
Yeah, so the Healthy Colony checklist is an arrangement of 6 steps, and there are 6 things that you're trying to look for every time you go into your beehive. So Cameron asked you, could you find the queen? That's because the queen is the essential component of the hive, and once you find her and have all these other steps checked off, you know that you have a healthy colony.
That's great. So we're sitting here in Washington, D.C. today having this conversation, and you're using this as a checklist to check on your bees back in North Carolina.
Yeah, so once we hit the plane and get back in North Carolina, we're going to put our bee suits on and get our bees ready for this winter.
Yeah, again, the suit's a very important part of that. Thanks for that. Now, there's a lot of technology that has been devoted in the last couple of years, especially into pollinators and bee health, and there's startups that monitor the state of beehives. But the other piece of the future of ag is, what does the future of the farmer look like? And that's what I think Kamani is a great example of what that might look like. Kamani, can you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in Sankofa Farms?
Like Cameron, I got involved with Sankofa Farms in 7th grade, where Mr. Bell would come and get us from our classes at Lowe's Grove Middle School, and he would take us to the courtyard, and we would work with the various projects. And one of the projects that stuck with me was being able to hatch baby chickens in the incubator over a 21-day process.
That is really neat. So my understanding is you were involved with Sankofa Farms right from the early beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about what the farm looked like at the very beginning?
It was a beautiful disaster. Because at the beginning of the farming, I pictured a big open land of a farm, and when I got there, it was the complete opposite. It was just a lot of waste, tree stumps, and weeds. But we had to literally work and clear the land so we can be able to grow crops and have our bees on the farm.
And so, what does it look like now?
It looks like an ideal farm when you look on the television and you see a farm. It's starting to look like that now.
That's good. That's good. So this is amazing to me, and what you do at Sankofa Farms. So tell us all a little bit, how has this experience, getting to experience the what happens on Sankofa Farms, how has that changed you in your perspective?
It changed me in having a better output on my future and what I like to solve in the future with staying connected with farming and getting fellow peers of my kind involved with farming.
That's really good. So, yeah, that absolutely deserves some applause. And it's not just about perspective. How do you think this has changed your future outlook? What do you think the future holds for you?
I think the future holds us getting more people involved with the farm and being able to break generational poverty in the African American community.
Yeah. So, Kamal, you've got to be super proud of these guys up here. You know, what else do you want to add?
I told myself I wasn't going to cry, but just like what they're working on is so much bigger than farming. It's bigger than Sankofa. they're really on to something really special, and we just appreciate that Bayer has partnered to help us in this process.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
I seriously want to thank you guys for coming up here and sharing your story with all of us today. We at Bayer Crop Science are absolutely privileged to do this kind of thing and sponsor operations like yours. It is critical that we increase the level of education about agriculture and where our food comes from, that we lean into innovation to solve some of the aspects, the challenging aspects that are facing us today in agriculture, and just absolutely critical to get the next generation of folks interested in technology and agriculture and onto the farm, because they absolutely are going to be the future of how we solve these things. The stakes are incredibly high. There's going to be another 2 billion people on this planet in the next 30-ish years that we're going to have to figure out how to feed, and it is going to take change, and it's going to take innovation, and we know that one of the things that drives that is an absolute diversity of perspective, of background, et cetera, to get as much of that opportunity converted into action as we possibly can. So it's absolutely going to be driven by folks like yourselves and the initiative at Sankofa Farm. So thank you guys again for coming up and sharing with all of us, and thank you all for the positive reaction.
And now, welcome Senator Mitt Romney, here with Atlantic staff writer McKay Coppins.
Senator, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Not much going on today. So.
No, it's a boring day, I'm sure. I'm sure the first thing you wanted to do was be up on stage and answer questions about it. We have a lot of issues we want to talk about today, but obviously I think we'd be remiss if we don't start with the news. The White House just released the call summary between President Trump and the President of Ukraine. What was your reaction? You've read it, I assume?
I have. My reaction was the same as I had a few days ago, which is this remains deeply troubling, and we'll see where it leads, but the first reaction is troubling.
Was it, there's some support for that. In the summary that we saw, did that amount to a quid pro quo agreement, or at least the implication of a quid pro quo, in your view?
I don't know that I've focused so much on the quid pro quo element as perhaps some do. There's just the question of, and I said this in my first reaction, which is, if the President of the United States asks or presses the leader of a foreign country to carry out an investigation of a political nature, that's troubling, and I feel that, and so clearly, if there were a quid pro quo, that would take it to an entirely more extreme level.
But in your mind, it's serious either way. You're essentially alone among Republican officials in expressing concern over this. So I do think it's worth articulating why you think it's so serious. And also, why do you think so many of your fellow Republicans have been either quiet on this subject or actively defending the president?
Well, there's such enormous power associated with being the party in power, both in the White House as well as in the Senate and the House. And of course, people know that in the House because you can pass all the bills you want if your party's in power, but also in the Senate, even though it requires 60 votes to actually get any legislation through. If you're the majority leader, you get to decide what we vote on. And it's extraordinary power. And so I think it's very natural for people to look at circumstances and see them in the light that's most amenable to their maintaining power and doing things to preserve their power. And I think part of that is that both parties feel very deeply that if the other party were in charge, that terrible things would happen for the country and for the people, and that it's critical for them to hold on to their leadership so that those awful things that Bernie Sanders is talking about won't come to pass. And so, I think it's just in human nature to see things in a way that is consistent with your own worldview and your sense of what's necessary for the preservation of your position of power. I don't know why I'm not afflicted to the same degree as perhaps others are in that regard. Maybe it's because I'm old and have done other things.
There are no other old senators, right?
One senator said, "Hey, welcome to the club here. It's a club for old men." So I fit right in.
But I mean, just to get back to that, you're describing partisanship that's been with us for a long time. But at some point, Congress is supposed to hold the executive branch accountable, right? There has to be a level of accountability. You are out there at least expressing concern and saying that there should be some accountability for these actions. What kind of accountability do you think the president should face given what you've learned so far? What should the consequences be?
Well, the consequences are being considered by the House, and I'm not going to give advice to Speaker Pelosi. She's going to do whatever she thinks is in the best interest of the country and in the best interest of her position of power and her party, and she's pursuing that. We'll see where that leads. There will be additional information that comes out as the whistleblower is heard from. The Senate is doing what I think is right, which is insisting that the whistleblower appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee, and so more information will come from that front.
Could this, in your view, rise to an impeachable offense?
I think it's again. I'm going to leave it at what I've said, and let the process gather the facts that will ultimately come out.
Okay, I might try to come back to you on that, but for now, let me ask you about this. When you expressed concern about this a few days ago, President Trump responded by tweeting a video about you losing the presidential election in 2012. So, first of all, what was that like? But I think more specifically, the president has done this with a lot of his critics, and specifically Republicans who aren't towing the party line in his view. He tries to kind of publicly humiliate them in some way. Do you think that has a chilling effect on your fellow Republicans' ability or willingness to speak out?
Well, in my case, I'd forgotten I lost, so it was a helpful reminder. In the case of other people, it's hard for me to know what impact it has, but I think people have to recognize that if you pick a fight with someone on Twitter, perhaps, and you have 5,000 followers, and the person you pick a fight with has, 25 million followers, that it's likely to be an unfair fight. And whether that shapes people's language or how they react, I don't know. But I think most people try and act out of a self-interest element to a certain degree, and I'm sure that's at play.
It doesn't seem to have rattled you necessarily. Why is that? Don't say because you're old.
No, it's not. It's not so much. I mean, part of it is just the home I grew up in. I grew up with a mom and a dad that had very strong personal convictions and expressed those convictions without reservation. I grew up in that setting, and that's sort of my view of what a real person does, what a real American does, is to express their views as they have them and not to worry about the consequences. I also think perhaps it's related to the fact that I had a life outside of politics. I do not define myself by how I do in campaigns. My career was in business. My passion is my family and my faith. So I define myself more in terms of my family, my faith, my career, and I'm at a point in life where I'm doing what I think is an important contribution, hopefully, but I don't feel enormous angst by how I'm viewed, or even, by the way, by losing an election. This is. And so whether it's, in my family's upbringing or just those other elements of my life, I don't know, but it doesn't bother me not to be real popular. Maybe that reminds me of high school.
You mentioned your faith, which I actually share, and I'm curious about Utah. Utah's a kind of idiosyncratic state in its politics. It's very conservative, very Republican, but the voters there have had kind of a tumultuous relationship with President Trump. Trump won that state, but with a plurality of the vote. His approval ratings have lagged behind in that state, other states. Why is it that you think that Utahns and particularly Latter-day Saints are not as excited to support this president?
I think people of faith have responded to the president in different ways. And some people of faith, as you know, in certain streams of religious thought, celebrate everything about the president, every aspect of his life and how he speaks and tweets and what he does. All those things are terrific, and they love it and they support it. In my faith, and the people I talk to in Utah generally, there are a great number of Republicans, overwhelming number of Republicans support the president. But they're very concerned about some of the personal behavior and the tweets and wish he wouldn't do some of the things he does. And I hear that a lot. And so they will vote for the president. They're supportive of the president. I think most Republicans in my state are irritated at me for not getting with the team. It's like, all right, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, you know? And so why aren't you with the team? And why are you critical? Why, just talk about those things in private. There are, I have a strong following among about a slice of pie that big, all right, and why is that? I don't know precisely, although in my faith people go to church every Sunday. They've been listening to sermons about honesty, integrity, treating people with respect. They've been hearing about that all their life, and some of that apparently sinks in.
I want to ask about your relationship with the president since you've gotten to Washington. Obviously, you've been critical of him. I think right when you entered the Senate, you wrote an op-ed saying that you were going to speak out on matters of character, especially when it comes to this president. Have you been to the Oval Office? What have your interactions been like with President Trump since you've gotten to Washington?
They've been cordial so far. And I was Lindsey Graham and I went over for lunch with the president. And so we sat in the Oval Office and spoke there for a while, and then we went into a little lunchroom to the side of the Oval Office, and we were talking about tariffs, and I expressed my view that the tariffs on aluminum and steel I thought were counterproductive, were hurting our industries more than they were hurting others, and I didn't like tariffs on friends at all. But I said, look, I support what you're doing on China. I think it's a good idea to push back on them. I said that I wished he would have done that with the support of our friends around the world, because I thought that would give us more clout in getting the Chinese to move. But nonetheless, calling China for the cheater it is in terms of global economic policies, I thought was the right thing to do, and I would support him in that regard. So we had a cordial conversation, and I spoke with him just a couple of days ago about another matter, and that was background check legislation. And I called and asked if he could give me a ring back. He called back shortly thereafter, and I encouraged him to give close consideration to enhancing our background check capacity, and so it's but I'm sure he has a cordial relationship with Nancy Pelosi as well, but he may not appreciate all the things she says or does, and I'm sure he disagrees with some of the things I've said, but he's willing to have that conversation. How that continues, I don't know. But, I'll continue to do what I know isn't popular, because my Democrat friends say, why you're voting for him on this policy and that policy? It's like, yeah, but those are policies I agree with. Those are the policies I campaigned for. So I agree with those policies. I'll vote with him on those things. I'll vote for his appointments, too, because those are good people, in my opinion. And as a president, you have the right to select the cabinet you want and the appointees you have, unless they're really, off the mark. But if you say or do something which I think is highly destructive or damaging to our national unity, then that's something I feel I've got to speak about. I mean, it's basically if the captain of your team says something really offensive, if you don't say anything, it suggests that you go along with it. And I'm a Republican. He's the captain of the team, I'll be with the team, but not when we say something of that nature.
I want to get to guns in a second, which is something you just brought up. But first, in 2012, you famously said that Russia was our greatest geopolitical foe. Mm-hmm. You were mocked by a lot of people in Washington at the time, who have, I think, since come around to maybe you being onto something there. More recently, though, you've said that you now believe that China is our greatest geopolitical foe. Why is that? And is the administration's approach, you talked about this a little bit, but is the approach working? Is the administration's approach to China working?
Well, first of all, I think Russia was the geopolitical adversary. They were poking us in the eye everywhere in the world, every bad actor they were supporting. And I think they continue to be motivated by by an overarching goal, which is just to bring down the United States of America any way they can. But long term, Russia's population is declining. We really don't buy anything from Russia that I can think of other than energy. Natural resources, so they're not really a long-term challenge to us. The greater challenge is that China is on a path which suggests a much stronger economy than ours, a much larger military capacity than ours, and a geopolitical adversary of some capability, and perhaps even more. They would like to be more powerful than we, so they represent a greater threat long-term. Hopefully, we can dissuade them from that course. The president has, in my view, taken the first right step, which is to say, stop, China, you can't keep doing it. We're not going to let you keep doing this. We're not going to let you take over the South China Sea with impunity. We're going to run our ships through there. We're not going to let you continue to steal our technology, drive our companies out of business. We're going to push on that. So I applaud that effort, and it was not done under prior administrations. That said, I don't think we have a comprehensive, effective strategy to confront China and to dissuade them from a course which would be counter to a course where they're a participant in a world where we share certain values and economic principles and human rights principles. And I don't blame the president or the administration for that. I just think it's difficult for us to put that together. We did that during the Cold War. George Kennan and his view ultimately became the strategy for the nation. In this case, it's complex. But China does have a strategy. And it's really extraordinary. I mean, one, we're going to manage our own people by watching everything they do and giving them credit scores based on their civic scores, rather, based on how supportive they are of the government. And then around the world, we're going to send faculty members to teach in universities all over the world, and we'll pay for them in Confucius Institutes, so we can change public attitudes in these nations that might otherwise confront us. And then we're going to build an enormous military, but we're not going to tell you exactly what we're doing. We're not going to report our spending or what we have. And then on an industrial policy basis, we're going to pick key industries of the future. It's not hard to pick out what the industries of the future are. And then we're going to invest in those heavily, and we're going to subsidize them and drive the foreign competition out of business. I mean, and the list goes on. They've got a very clear strategy with a clear goal, and we're taking the first step. I applaud the first step, but we haven't done the rest yet.
I want to move on in the time we have left to a couple of legislative areas that you're pursuing. One, you mentioned guns. Gun violence has been one of the ongoing tragic stories in American life for a long time now. And I think there's a lot of frustration out there that Washington has not been able to do anything about it. You're new to the Senate, relatively speaking. Do you see any areas of bipartisan agreement or potential bipartisan agreement that could actually make a difference in the gun violence problem in America?
Two things. One, I think a very effective background check technology and an insistence that any commercial sale must be accompanied by a background check. I think that would make a difference. I don't know how big, but I think it would make some difference, and it's something we ought to do. And there's legislation to that effect. As you know, Toomey and Joe Manchin have a piece of legislation. They're looking at ways to deal with some of the complicating features, like how do you deal with somebody who lives a long way from a gun store that wants to get a background check, but it would require a 200-mile drive for them to do so. So there's some questions like that they're trying to deal with. But that's an approach I think will make a difference.
You're open to voting for Manchin Toomey?
The principle of that is something I would support. We'll see what the final legislation looks like, but I'm inclined to support that. Then there's something else, which is over the last decade there have been about 450 murders associated with bias and hatred of some kind. And of those, 73% were carried out by white supremacists. And so a much more concerted effort to deal with extremism in our own country could have a significant impact.
What would that look like?
Well, as in all things, it starts at the top. It means a real effort on the part of the administration and the president himself to really speak out aggressively against any kind of bias against individuals as a result of their race, their creed, their sexual orientation, their religion, and so forth. That starts there, and extreme care in how we as leaders of all kinds, university presidents, pastors, parents, how we talk about and interact with our kids and others about issues of that nature. I think that has an impact. But 73% of these murders based upon bias are by white supremacists. This is a real terrorist threat at home.
Do you think there's a danger in certain elements of the more mainstream political right in America flirting with white supremacy or engaging with it?
Oh, sure.
Have you seen that?
Well, we all watch the news. We all we see what's on TV. But I think there have been individuals who said things that I think encourage a degree of racism, and without question, that's a real problem. And given the consequence of such a thing, I mean, we are, people love to say our diversity is our strength, and I don't disagree with that. But for those who don't think that's the case, for those who wish we could be like Japan, where all the people are of the same ethnicity, recognize we aren't Japan. We are diverse. We're a highly diverse nation. We're going to become more diverse as time goes on. Like it or not, we must be united as a nation if we're going to remain the leader of the world, and if we're going to preserve freedom in the world against an authoritarian regime in China, and by the way, Russia joining in with them. There's a battle going on right now between those nations that believe in individual freedom and economic freedom and those that believe in authoritarianism. And the only way we win is if America remains strong, number one, and that means united. So this becomes a high priority for us to maintain our unity. And by the way, the only way a small nation, ours, 330 million, competes long-term with a big nation, 1.4 billion, China, is by linking arms with our friends around the world. What distinguishes us, one of the many things that distinguishes us in a geopolitical sense from China is that we have a lot of friends, and they don't have friends. We've got a lot of friends. It's a huge advantage. So taking advantage of our friendships, economically, militarily, geopolitically, fostering those things, I want to see a strong Europe. I want Europe extraordinarily strong. I want them robust and growing, and I want to be linked as much as we can, because we're confronting a competitor unlike anything we've seen. The old Soviet Union was belligerent but extraordinarily weak. The new competitor, China, is extraordinarily strong. Not as belligerent as the old Soviet Union was, but extraordinarily strong. And getting them to take a course which makes them a partner on the world stage and not an adversary is very much in the interest of freedom.
So if one of the concerns that you have about America's kind of fracturing and divisions that weakens the country is racism and other forms of bigotry or prejudice, what do you think, how should we approach immigration when it comes to that? I think a lot of people would say that the way President Trump, setting a policy aside, the way he talks about immigrants, the way he talks about immigration, encourages racist attitudes, xenophobic attitudes. What do you think that's true? And either way, do you believe that there is a way to fix the immigration system without demonizing immigrants?
Certainly, and I think it's most unfortunate when any political person says things which can be interpreted as demonizing people based upon their immigration status or their race, religion, and so forth. And do we have an answer there? Yeah, we need immigration. Our country needs legal immigration. We've got to have it. I say that we all talk about we want GDP growth. And it's like most people wonder what the heck is GDP anyway, but we want GDP growth. GDP growth is a mathematical function of two things. One is output per worker, and the other is number of workers. So if your number of workers is going down because you're shrinking as a population, and the U.S. population will shrink without immigration. So if you want GDP growth, which is a good thing, by the way, you want to have more people come into you want people come into our country. And we celebrate people coming in legally. It's not impossible to find a system that works. I happen to think that a mandatory E-Verify system, meaning employers must check E-Verify when they hire someone. And if they hire someone that's here illegally, you sanction the employer, not the employee, the employer. You put penalties on them. So immigration is not rocket science. Politically challenging, but not rocket science. We got other problems like China. That's tough. That's really tough. Healthcare, that's really tough. But immigration, this is not a tough one. And we need a deal to get done where what Republicans are concerned about, what Democrats are concerned about, we're able to give each side something. So it's a win. I mean, one of the things you recognize, you all do, is that in Washington, for something to happen, it must be seen as a win for both parties. And this is not real hard. So a deal only gets done when it's going to be good and a win for both parties. LBJ, when he put in fostered the Civil Rights Act, gave credit to Everett Dirksen. Get Republicans on this. Make this a joint success. You have to do the same.
So my last question as we wrap up, is there any likelihood, any possibility of deals like that getting done while impeachment is looming over Washington?
I think it's very difficult for deals to get done right now. Anytime, even during an election cycle, it's very hard to get deals done. And I think this only adds to the difficulty of making progress. So it's and now, you know, Will Rogers used to say that you weren't safe whenever Congress was in session, and he'd amend that now. He said you're safe even when Congress is in session, and so it's going to be hard to get some of these things done. But a number of us are still fighting and hoping to get some things done, which are wins for both sides and wins for the American people.
Senator Romney, thank you for your time.
Thanks, McKay. Thank you.
Please welcome back